think we can start our webinar. First of all, let me welcome everybody and thank you very much for participating in this online event organized by the Master's Degree in International Relations and Eastern Mediterranean Studies of the Department of Politics and Governance at the University of Nicosia. My name is Michalis Kontos. I am an associate professor at the Department of Politics and Governance and the program coordinator of the master's degree in International Relations and Eastern Mediterranean Studies. Let me start by saying a few things about our program, our master's program, and explaining the process that we will follow today before I give the floor to the main speakers in the event. Our master's program is a unique academic program of its kind in the sense that it is the only master's degree in international relations that focuses on area studies in the Eastern Mediterranean region. So it is a program that delves into affairs related with energy geopolitics, the law of the sea, the history and politics of past and contemporary Eastern Mediterranean, alongside the core international relations modules like theory of international relations, international political economy, and a big group of elective courses that go across the fields of international relations and Eastern Mediterranean studies. The structure of the program is based on the model that is approved by the Cyprus Quality Assurance Agency, which regulates tertiary education in Cyprus according to the European Agency of Quality Assurance. And it is a structure that involves 90 ECTS, 90 credits, which derive from 6 core requirements that can be taken in 2 semesters, or they can be taken on a part-time basis in more than 2 semesters, plus 30 ECTS that derive from electives, either 3 elective courses or a master thesis plus 1 elective course. Students who are admitted in fall semester do have the opportunity, if they choose so, to graduate in 1 year plus summer. In other words, in 2 semesters, fall and spring, plus summer, in case they choose to take a master thesis plus 1 elective instead of 3 electives. So we do give this opportunity, but other than that, students can take 3 courses per semester without taking any summer courses and graduate in 1 year and a half, or they can take courses on a part-time basis, assuming that they will complete their studies in maximum 8 semesters. these arrangements give the opportunity both to people who would like to graduate urgently in as less time as possible, as well as to people who, due to overwhelming professional or family obligations, prefer to expand their studies and take less ECTS per semester than the maximum allowed. And with a master's degree in international relations and Eastern Mediterranean studies, you can pursue or enhance a career in several fields of public sector, like, for example, in the diplomatic corps or in security bodies in the military, for example. We do have a lot of students already from these two fields, as well as in many other fields of the private sector, in international organizations, research centers, or anywhere that a master's degree in international relations and Eastern Mediterranean studies could provide you with useful skills. So that was a brief introduction regarding our master's degree program. Let me inform you that after the end of the two presentations that we have scheduled, we will have a Q&A session. For that purpose, I would kindly ask our presenters to stick with the timetable, 15 minutes each, so as to spare enough time for the Q&A session at the end. The Q&A session will be based on questions that you can send beforehand in written form by using the chat application. So during the two presentations, I will receive questions in the chat application, and if possible, I will read them all at the end and ask the presenters for their take. So we will start with our first presentation, titled "The Conflictual Context of Current Developments in the Eastern Mediterranean." The presenter is Professor Hubert Faustmann, a historian and political scientist with vast experience in the study of the Eastern Mediterranean. Hubert, the floor is yours. I guess you can share a presentation with us.
Yes, Michalis, thank you so much. First of all, let's do the classical technical question. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Hubert, to me, it's perfectly visible. You can enlarge it as much as you want. It's fine. Now it's a full screen mode. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. So a very warm welcome and good evening from my side. What I'm giving you is an updated, adjusted version of an opening lecture I give in my course on Eastern Mediterranean history and politics, and I named it "The Conflictual Context of Current Developments in the Eastern Mediterranean," because obviously I will make the argument that things have changed since October 7th, 2023, and I try to explain, first of all, why I believe that the Eastern Mediterranean, and I have to be clear here, the Eastern Mediterranean as a geopolitical space are a bit blurred in terms of definition, because on the one hand, a lot of the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean are part of the Middle East, and a lot of what I will talk about applies to the Middle East, and therefore the countries in the East Med that belong to it. But it's also more than this, because we include countries like Greece and Turkey, and depending where you stand, also Cyprus in that course, and that gives it a unique structure. And the argument, as you will see, is made that it's a geopolitical space by itself. So the topic I'm trying to address is, why is the Eastern Mediterranean, as an extension of the Middle East, plus the Greek-Turkish-Cyprus triangle, one of the most conflict-ridden regions with a high risk of a large-scale war? So I started already talking about the East Med as a newly emerging geopolitical space in a changing international system that set in with a US withdrawal, an alleged or real one, that's debate, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, which allowed external players, Turkey, Russia, but we can also discuss China, to extend their powers, and other regional players who've created their own networks. What makes the Eastern Mediterranean a geopolitical space for the time being is the discovery of gas by some of the countries of the East Med, and that had led to cooperation, but also confrontation over these gas issues. And that's the conceptual background while we started the class on the history and politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. The way I teach it, it's a very wide definition. We go from Greece all along all coastal states of the Eastern Mediterranean, so Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, and Libya are countries we look into. I just move a bit this window a bit to the left because it covers part of my PowerPoint. So what I'm trying to substantiate is the following quote from a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs. The Middle East has become the world's most polarized region and, paradoxically, its most integrated. That combination, along with weak state structures, powerful non-state actors, and multiple transitions occurring almost simultaneously, also makes the Middle East the world's most volatile region. And in order to substantiate this claim, it's good to look into the basic fault lines that shape that region. That brings us to my second quote: the story of the Middle East is one of a succession of rifts or fault lines, each new one sitting on top of its precursors, some taking momentary precedence over others, not even truly or fully, not ever truly or fully resolved. So what are these rifts, fault lines, conflict structures that shape the Eastern Mediterranean and by extension the Middle East? So that's step 4. It's Israel against those who don't like the state of Israel, Iran versus Saudi Arabia. They're competing Sunni blocks. That is mainly, there's a spelling, Turkey and Qatar versus Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, and our beloved Cyprus, Greece, Turkey conflict triangle that also includes the Cyprus problem. So that's the Middle East, which, as I said, blurs with our East Med class. So let's elaborate a bit on the first fault line. The main adversaries of Israel, there are many, but if we look at the last years and then we look at what happened since 2023, are Iran and its proxies, plus the Palestinians who are in a confrontation with Israel and Syria, at least before the fall of the Assad regime and possibly also after. And this confrontation is played out in different areas, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Syria, today in different form, but before the fall of the Assad by hitting his allies, Iranian proxies, in Lebanon fighting Hezbollah, and even in Iraq. What I will argue is that until October 7th, this Israeli confrontation with its enemies that shaped the region much more in the past, but there's a reconciliation going on with more and more countries making up with Israel, has transformed itself and had taken a kind of a backseat, while the Iranian-Saudi Arabian rivalry and the inner Sunni rivalries have become more prominent and have merged. So at some stage it was the Gulf states and Israel joined by their dislike of Iran and its proxies. But I said we're in a different situation. That's partially what my lecture is about. The proxies of Iran and Iran itself are now in a much, much weaker position than they were before the attack of Hamas on Israeli citizens on the 7th of October 2023. And on top of it, we have the toppling of the Assad regime and a new government in power with an uncertain future. So the second fault line is an old conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran that basically took more dynamic proportions after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. They both used the difference that is Shia versus Sunni as a marker, but one can argue it's also a great power rivalry between two countries who try to extend their influence in the region and happen to be divided by different religions, and they fight for influence in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, or the Gulf states. Yeah? And as I said, it merged in the last years, as I said on the previous slide. Then you have an inner Sunni-Sunna rivalry, and that's very much Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates against Turkey and Qatar. And where they mainly disagree, next to fighting who's boss in the Sunni world, is their relationship to political Islam, and in particular to the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey and Qatar support movements that are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia are deadly opposed to Islamists and fight them wherever they can. And this is fought out in countries like Egypt, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, or Sudan, but not only that. What makes things so complicated and the situation so explosive is that they overlap, and different fault lines and countries on different sides of the fault lines sometimes hook up with each other and conflicts overlap. So Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar and Turkey all opposed Assad, but then supported different groups. Qatar and Turkey, more Muslim Brotherhood or Islamist-oriented groups, and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, others. In Egypt, the Morsi regime was supported by Qatar and Turkey and opposed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who tried to bring it down and succeeded so in 2013. There are sub-dimensions of it, like Qatar and Turkey fear Iran, but dislike Saudi Arabia even more. That complicates things. Or you have even a proxy like Hamas supporting Assad whenever he hits Israel, but opposing him the moment there was a revolution against his regime in the context of the Arab Spring. So you see these fault lines on a map. I'll leave it just for 2 or 3 more seconds for you to digest that geopolitically structure the region, leaving at the moment the Greek-Turkish Cypriot triangle out. So why is the Middle East so explosive on top of these fault lines? The one reason is that local struggles quickly take regional significance because the region is so polarized and at the same time so integrated. So whenever something happens, outside actors jump in and support forces in countries where conflicts are going on, like Syria or Libya, for example, and that, because of the involvement of outside powers, dramatically increases the risk of large-scale wars. So if you see already what the civil war in Syria brought about, which initially was a suppression of a local uprising in the context of the Arab Spring, more than a dozen countries got sucked in, resulting, if we talk about great powers, and we'll talk about them a bit later, in the largest number of Russians ever killed by Americans, or bringing Russia, Turkey, but also Israel and Iran close to war. Libya is another classical case where a lot of outside players fight out their interests, their wars, supporting proxies and sides in the conflict. So what doesn't help is the lack of effective communications. They don't talk to each other very much. Yeah, so Iran and Israel don't talk. Iran and Saudi Arabia, at least until 2023, do not talk. And there's very little real diplomacy, at least until very recently, between the Sunni blocs. Lack of economic integration doesn't help either. Yeah? And politically, so economically, it's very little integrated. And even politically, the Arab League, I love that quote, is less coherent than the EU, less effective than the African Union, and more dysfunctional than the Organization of the American States. That's a nice insult for the Arab League. So there's no regional entity, neither in the Middle East nor in the East Med, in which the Arab countries and the 3 most important non-Arab players, Iran, Israel, and Turkey, are actually members of. The only organization in the East Med is the East Med Gas Forum, and that's basically a talking show. So unified space, another reason that makes things so dangerous when things escalate, is that the ideologies, ideas, movements that spread across countries and can found in different countries of the region. So the Muslim Brotherhood is active in a variety of countries in the region. So are Shiite movements or Shia religious minorities. So it's very quickly that other countries get interested and sucked in Muslim Brotherhood supporting other Muslim Brotherhoods. Then you have media outlets that try to regionally dominate public discourses, from Al Jazeera in Qatar against Al Arabiya in Saudi Arabia. You have other causes like the Palestinian cause that resonates widely in the region. And you have Kurdish nationalism that is an issue in Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey. So as said, I'm trying to make the argument that local confrontations have a high potential because of this polarization and integration to escalate into large-scale wars and suck in other countries and players. So when something happens, local militias get support from outside. The Houthis have domestic agendas, so does Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria opposition groups. But in this polarized, integrated region, they get summarized or get used by outside players. Yeah, and so things and developments spread. Arab Spring spread like wildfire. The Muslim Brotherhood's fate in Egypt interested Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and they fought it out with the success of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. As I said, Libya, these are just Egypt and Turkey, but there are others who got sucked in. The Syrian civil war is really the story of everybody going in. Militias and local players and great powers and outside players, and Yemen, another country where confrontations between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE were fought out on the ground using local players and local militias with local agendas. So what doesn't help is that we're in a region with a lot of unstable and dysfunctional states in this polarized and integrated framework. So many governments do not control all parts of their country. Libya, Syria, and Yemen are just three prominent examples, and you have powerful non-state actors, you see them listed here, who control considerable parts of these countries and are powerful players by themselves. On top of it, there are problems internally. So Hamas is fighting with other jihadist groups for the control of Gaza, or did so before October 2023. And what makes things more complicated is what I was alluding to on the previous slide, is that these non-state actors are proxies and independent players at the same time. And that brings another dimension of danger into it. So since the states are weak, the others mess with those countries. But then it's not really clear. If Hezbollah shoots a missile at Israel, was this Hezbollah shooting a missile, or was this Hezbollah on orders of Iran shooting a missile? So is the problem Hezbollah, or is the problem Iran? So misattribution of an attack, and therefore responding to the wrong party or responding to more parties that were actually involved, is another element that adds to the layers of risk. And let's talk about the great power politics, because this regional politics by regional players are not happening without the involvement of the big guys. Historically speaking, is that the US support for some movements in the Arab Spring also led to the dismantling of some of the region, and the feeling that the dynamics, that countries and governments are up for grabs. China went in, a resurgent Russia went in Syria and in Libya. And there's a debate about a relative decline and retreat under the first Trump administration, and we'll have to debate how it's going to look like under the second Trump administration. So one disputable result is that you have a growing Chinese and Russian influence, which then also emboldened Iran to become more assertive, or Turkey during the first Trump presidency to be more confrontational towards Cyprus and Greece, in particular in respect to drilling or researching in the exclusive economic zones of those two countries. So after talking so much about conflict, things get more complicated, because after confronting each other without much outcome, in 2022, a counter trend set in where the sides tried to de-escalate and cooperate after confronting each other directly or in all kinds of proxy confrontations. So Saudi Arabia and Iran started a dialogue. Turkey repaired ties with Egypt and Israel and still tries so in a complicated process. So everybody talked to everybody else, with a climax and the arrival of the Chinese officially as a big player in the region, with a brokered rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and its arch enemy, Iran. So we have a period of détente. One reason is, as I said, they were confronting each other, but won very little. But another decisive element is that Qatar and Turkey, that had been supporting political Islam or Islamists, had basically lost as far as their proxies are concerned. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was brutally defeated. In other countries, it was losing popularity. So the agenda, the conflictual agenda that drove Turkey and Qatar to act in support of the Muslim Brotherhood was a less dominant issue, given their weakening or defeat in different areas. So let's come to the conclusion. What has happened since the 7th of October 2023. And why do I argue now that we're in the process of a transforming architecture of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East? Some of the stuff I was talking about is changing dramatically. An obvious change is the weakening of Iran and its proxies. We don't know how permanent this is going to be, but for the time being, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran are definitely weakened. The Houthis, we can debate how strong they still are as the last standing proxy of Iran, of significant strength for the time being. We do not know how the situation with Iran over its construction of nuclear weapons will turn out. Is it going to be a war, or is it going to be a deal? Depending who gets it their way. Israel clearly prefers war. Trump, for the time being, apparently a deal. We have a dramatic transformation in Syria with the fall of Assad and at least a regime with an Islamist background taking over with an uncertain future to what extent they can regain control over their country. It doesn't look good in terms of Israeli support for the Druze or Israeli taking some territory. Turkey is the big winner, who gets a lot of influence. Israel, as I said, has taken territory in Syria and protects the Druze. You have a replacement of the Shia crescent, so influence of Iran down to Lebanon, from Iran to Lebanon is now replaced with a Sunni axis, with Turkey being the big winner in that proxy, in the confrontation over Syria. Lebanon has a government, that's good news, but still a poor country. Egypt is domestically unstable, but nobody wants destabilization. It's an interesting issue. Libya remains a divided, failing state. Israel will probably have a lot of questions in the discussion. In my view, is at the current on an expansionist drive, both in Gaza, the West Bank, potentially in Syria. It has paid not a very high price for its policies and the crushing and treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza, while at the same time facing democratic backsliding. The Palestinians, I haven't talked much about, at the moment are in a very, very poor state, divided, marginalized, and potentially ethnically cleansed, depending what happens in Gaza. Turkey is one of the winners in terms of regional dynamics, in particular in Syria, and even its recent arrest from the main opposition leader has not led to dramatic consequences. So in my argument is also that this regional détente that was interrupted by the war in Gaza has not led to the complete isolation of Israel. The governments have been very careful, not the population, but the governments have not broken off diplomatic relations. And my hunch is that's a system of increased cooperation without resolving their conflicts, waiting to snap back in a face-saving way, but it is anything but uncertain. My last slide, Michalis, is how Cyprus doing. Yeah, it's in the eye of the storm. That's the fun part. Studying with us is safe. Living here is safe. Living in the region, less so. Yeah, that's part of my argument. Its beloved Cyprus problem is in a stalemate for 7 years and not much is happening. Greek-Turkish relations, they have improved, but are very, very fragile. We have now a new president who's apparently contemplating what to do with the regions. So to rephrase a Clash song is, should I stay or should I go? They've withdrawn some troops from Syria, supporting Israel, and it's not really clear what role he will play. He's negotiating with Iran. So are they more in? Are they less in? Russia has a severe setback in Syria. So for them, it's can I stay or do I have to go? It's not clear if they will lose their bases in Syria. For the time being, they still have a foothold in Libya and might come back. So if we sum it up, so as far as great power rivalry is concerned, we have an unclear American role, an unclear Russian role, unclear how much the Chinese will get into this, and the EU is the usual politically ignored, potentially paying joke that's not taken too serious by the conflicting partners. Domestically, things are also not looking great. You have democratic backsliding in Turkey and Israel, some hope for improvements on a low level in Syria and Lebanon, desperation in Palestine, a powder cake in Egypt and divided Libya, and domestic tensions in Turkey, Greece, and all quiet on the Cyprus front. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hubert. You've brought up a lot of issues, a great variety actually of different topics. Now I would kindly ask you to unshare your PowerPoint, and I am now giving the floor, before I give the floor to the next speaker, Let me just remind you that you can send your questions through the chat application. I have already received some of them. Now, the next speaker is Dr. Konstantinos Adamides, Associate Professor and the head of the Department of Politics and Governance, who is going to present a topic titled, Who is the Security Provider in the East Med Regional Security Complex? Konstantine, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Unmuting always helps. Well, hello again. Thank you very much for joining. I'm very happy you did, actually. I didn't expect that at 7 p.m., so this is exciting. And Hubert gave us quite a few issues to consider, historical and future-oriented. So what I will try to do is, well, make it even a little bit more complicated by narrowing down to the East Med and asking the question, who is the security provider, which I don't have an answer to, by the way. So spoiler alert, we don't know. So what I will try to do, and the logic of this presentation is mostly to indicate the kind of discussions that we can have in talks like this. So I didn't take this from a specific lecture, but rather I just compiled a few questions that could easily be part of our masters in particular courses like the one that just Hubert talked about. So to understand the security complexities of the Eastern Mediterranean, we need to ask some key questions. And some of these questions is, what kind of insecurities do we observe? And Hubert alluded to the problem of attribution, among other things, which is absolutely true. But that's just one aspect. And what about the regional threats? How are they different compared to other threats? And when I say other threats, I specifically mean this region, and not necessarily the Middle East, which does indeed have a major impact elsewhere as well. And then we move on, and we say, given that we have these threats, what kind of deterrent strategies exist, if they exist? What can we do about it? And can small states play a role? I'm not going to have time to talk about small states, but we should keep it in mind. We can, of course, discuss it during the Q&A, but what is the role of small states in such security complexes? And then, of course, we cannot ignore the orange variable in the picture, President Trump, his own security. How does that kind of turn the tables, essentially? Am I hear an echo or something? I don't know if somebody has their mic on. And I will focus a little bit on Turkey's military ambitions and hegemonic aspirations, because in the Eastern Mediterranean, whether we like it or not, Turkey is the biggest player. So, going to the first question, the kind of type of insecurities that we could consider is, of course, traditional military threats like state conflicts. We talked about them a lot, but also non-state actors. Hezbollah, Mosul, you name it, right? But then, on top of that, you don't just have the proxies, but you actually have non-state actors who engage in other types of activity, like cyber attacks, which could be state or non-state sponsored, of course. Other type of insecurities for this region could also include economic dependencies, especially when it comes to energy resources. And I think this is another key area. And lastly, which for me is the most interesting part, is what we can call gray zone, right? Which is anything basically below the threshold of actual conflict, of actual war, but still significant enough to be disruptive. This could be anything from cyber threats to disinformation campaigns, to questioning sovereignty and maritime delimitations, and so on and so forth. So, I'm not going through the history because Hubert went, over it, so I'm not going to repeat myself. I'll try to save some time. Just putting it down here. I also split up the violent, non-violent spillover effects that conflicts can have, like immigration, of course, and then, of course, you have the even long-term or medium-term threats that come from individuals who are stationed for longer time in specific regions and how they can turn into assets for hostile countries. And this is an issue that we must consider, because in the region here we have a little bit of everything. In Cyprus, for instance, we have both Iranians and Syrians and Israelis and Lebanese. So you can imagine we have kind of a mix that can be extremely interesting, especially for the intelligence services. So I'm not going to go over this since we talked about it. An additional topic that I think is extremely important when we look at any region is how do extra-regional conflicts influence our region? And in this case, how does the war in Ukraine influence the regional security complex of the Eastern Mediterranean? And I think this is a very, very important question. We can discuss it further in the Q&A, but it becomes important not only in terms of the conflict and alliances and who helps who, but also in terms of how the conflict will be resolved in Ukraine can have a major impact on how other conflicts in the region, and primarily the one in Cyprus, may be resolved in the future or not. And then, of course, what is the Turkish role in this regional security complex? So let me first take a step back and talk about a little bit what we mean with regional security complex. And this is a very weird map going back to 20 years ago. And this map, well, it was published 20 years ago, but this map is actually from the Cold War, primarily. The good old times, the simple times, where the world was very easily distinguished in terms of security complexes. And according to the authors like Barry Buzan, Bayer, and other like giants of international relations, they essentially split the world into these security complexes, like the North American security complex, the European, the post-Soviet, the Middle Eastern, and so on and so forth. So after the Cold War, especially during the end of the Cold War and a little bit later, the idea was that you have the post-Soviet regional security complex, you have the European one, so those were relatively speaking stable. You had the Middle Eastern one, which was always unstable, like we heard from Uber, and then you had some states like Turkey, that acted as an insulator state. And what that meant is that it kind of split up these security complexes and acted as a form of a buffer. And this matters because this is no longer the case. Because, like very correctly Uber started his presentation, the Eastern Mediterranean is becoming a very distinct region. And now, geopolitically speaking, geographically speaking, Zorba has been there, but geopolitically, it's becoming much more distinct. So we have this situation where it's right in the middle of three security complexes and an insulator state, Turkey, right? But the problem is that things have changed. The security relations changed. We have a huge spillover from the Middle East security complex towards Europe, especially because of Israel and because of the Gulf states playing a different role now, especially the Emirates, for instance. And then regional actors, such as Turkey, want to change their roles. They have changed their roles. They no longer want to play the role of insulators. They're hegemons, or aspiring hegemons. And then you have the key involvement of extra-regional actors, like the US, like China, like Russia. And of course, what ignited a lot of this was the discovery of hydrocarbons, which kind of brought these possibilities for relationships to the surface. So I'm going to turn to Turkey now, because it was the actor that actually changed the most in the region, primarily because it's very big and very powerful, but also because its identity keeps changing, as opposed, let's say, to the Greek identity, and I'm talking about Greece, not Cyprus, which was with the West, stayed with the West, not much has changed historically. So if you look at Turkey, we should see a few things to keep in mind. One is it has this constant feeling of encirclement. And the second is that it has this quest for regional hegemony and strategic autonomy. The encirclement has grown significantly after the attempted coup in 2016, and many former friends became frenemies, like Israel, for instance, and as many Israeli colleagues tell us, it's no longer even frenemies, but it's becoming actually more towards completely enemies. And when I say that they feel that they're being encircled, these are some statistics that are actually very recent, relatively speaking, 5 years ago, of how the Turks consider, what the Turks consider to be a threat. In the US, 70% consider the US to be a threat. Israel, Syria, Iran, Greece, Armenia, Iraq, Russia, UK, France, Germany, basically everyone. Everyone that matters is considered to be pretty much a threat. So this feeling of encirclement has a major impact in the way it behaves, right? The second is what we hear very, very often, the hegemony part. And a lot has to do with the fact that the West is no longer a model to emulate. Turkey doesn't see the West anymore as someone like, I want to be like you. Therefore, autonomy and hegemony has become much, much more attractive. But this creates a gap, a widening gap with the West and the rest that are consolidating towards one direction, whereas Turkey aspires to be a third pole, basically, as Zinon Asjaras and others have called it. So ideologically, you have this Latin Eurasian hegemony that does not want to depend on the West, and therefore has anti-Western standards. On a strategic level now, it is revisionist, and we use it in a very negative way, of course, but the truth is it means that it's simply changing things, right? In this international system that is being changed, Turkey is a central country. It's no longer an insular country, and it aims, therefore, to have regional influence, not only, of course, but in Syria, in Somalia, in Libya, in Azerbaijan, you name it. And this leads to escalations. Yes, things have been relatively stable recently, but if you look at this map, for instance, the blue homeland map, this cannot be negotiated in any way with the Greeks, for instance, right? So this is a form of constant potential for escalation, or like Hoover said, a very fragile kind of status quo, right? And I'm sorry, I'm speaking through this, but because I know we don't have much time, but I want to talk about how is this driven. So we talked a little bit about the strategy and why this is happening. So let's talk about now the practical ways that this is happening. For this to happen, a lot depends on the militarization of the Turkish foreign policy. So a lot of it is driven by the fact that certain variables must be in place in order to be able to do what Turkey does. So revisionism requires three things: permissive environment, the credibility to do things, and the willingness to do things. Now, the permissive environment is there because of all the instability that Hubert talks about, and because we had this US withdrawal from the region, basically. So it left the region without a security provider. It left the region without a hegemony. So what this means is that essentially Turkey took advantage of a gap. The credibility, I think Turkey is one of the most credible countries when it comes to taking actions. And of course, one of the most willing countries to send troops, to get people killed. I'm sorry, I hear someone. Felipe or something, can you please mute? But how do we do this? And why we call it, militarization of the Turkish foreign policy? Because a lot has to do with hard power, and hard power requires defense industry and defense autonomy. Therefore, the strategic goal is defense autonomy. And to give you an idea, in less than 20 years, it went from 2003 to 2020, basically. It went from 50 companies in the defense industry to over 1,500 companies. In just 18 years. It's an insane growth. More importantly, however, it focused on defense economics, which means that the defense industry, the defense industrial sector of Turkey was integrated into the economy. So all of these things had a huge change in the way it did things. And that's why we see a lot of coercive diplomacy through hard power projection, the constant willingness and projection of credibility, if you wish, to act autonomously, and so on and so forth. Let me see what else I can say before I shut up, because I know I've been over talking. This leads to the externalization of influence, meaning that it wants to externalize its security before it comes home. That's why we see Turkey having and this has a huge influence in the region and huge influence on who is the security provider. So that's why we see Turkey having bases in Cyprus and Syria and Libya and Somalia and elsewhere, right? It externalizes all of that in northern Iraq and many other places. So what we practically observe, basically, is increased military capabilities and regional interventions. We see that there is the EU influence and NATO dynamics have changed to the degree that this is very possible, and Turkey's quest for autonomy is actually shaping significantly its own security posture. And then we have this. We changed again everything, right? We have the shift in the US foreign policy, reduced emphasis of NATO in the European security dimension, and all these things. Richard Holbrooke, in 1995, exactly 30 years ago, said America, a European power, in one of his most interesting articles, without a question mark. America, a European power. And basically what he claimed was that the US security depended on European security architecture. And all of this now is changing. So we have to ask questions when it comes to who is the security provider. Are we talking about more bilateral security relations? Is this the way forward? Can this decoupling be a blessing in disguise for the EU when it comes to the defense sector? What role will China play, especially when it comes to technology? So, with these things in mind, what kind of deterrence strategies do we have? And for whom? Because economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure can only go back so far, and it depends against whom. Against Turkey? Highly unlikely. It's a NATO member. It's extremely important for the EU, whether we like it or not. Very, very important for the EU. Against non-state actors, not really an option to put sanctions. So, military alliance, is that a deterrence? What happens now that NATO is, there's a small question mark, and what happens to states like Cyprus that is not part of NATO? Is it deterrence through technology, maybe? But then again, what about small states? Irrespective of how good they are with technology, they're still small states. How can we link this? I'm not going to get into that because I know I took way too much time. We can discuss how the two are linked. We can discuss commonalities. But the bottom line, and I'm really finishing, the bottom line is that given these complexities and this constant changing environment, it is extremely difficult to pinpoint who is the security provider and for whom, for how long, and for which kind of threats, which is how I started. So we're not just talking about territorial threats like we used to in the past. And I'm gonna stop here. Sorry, I abused my time.
Thank you very much, Constantine. a very insightful presentation based on IR theories, security theories that we actually teach in our program and we use in our scholarly presentations and publications. Now, I have received 2 questions. I'm sure that you can see them. Question number 1, how decisive is Russia's current role in East Med conflict, and how does it influence Cyprus? Question number 2, do you believe that Turkey's privileged position as a mediator in Middle Eastern affairs could alter the current state of international relations between the countries? And if yes, in what way? I will give the floor first to Hubert. Hubert, I think you can answer both questions, or you can choose one of them if you prefer.
I think the first one is clearly more aimed at my presentation. I think the second one at Konstantinos. So we start there and maybe then complement each other's input. So I will first only talk about the first one. I have my opinion on the second, but I'll leave that then to Konstantinos first. Okay, that could be a very long answer. In order to keep this within reasonable limits, let's look at 2 countries where Russia is most prominently involved in the region. That is Syria, that is Libya, within the East Med context. And the question, and the thing is, we don't really know as far as Syria is concerned. I mean, the fall of the Assad regime, which Russia basically bombed to victory in 2015, has fallen. And everybody thought now Russia is going to kick out. They removed the equipment, they moved it to Libya and expected to be kicked out. But then they started talking to the new regime. So the same people they have bombed are talking to Russia. And depending which analyst you listen to, the dynamics are very interesting because Turkey has now such a strong influence. And an argument is made that the new regime in Syria, so not really big fans of the Russians, might want to keep the Russians in the country as a counterweight to Turkish influence and maybe on a constraint on Israeli action. So it's not really clear if the Russians, that's why I said, can we stay or do we have to go? It's not really clear how they're going to end up in Syria. They might as very well keep their bases. And what makes things more complicated is what I and Konstantinos have been alluding to. Since Trump is in power, whatever we assumed about regional politics in the East Med is off. And now it's a guessing game. What this man is going to do next is his signals in Syria ambivalent, as that he withdrew 1,000 of the allegedly 2,000 troops. So that's a disengagement without complete disengagement. But an argument I heard, which is interesting, is if it's correct that he's trying to lure away Russia from China by giving it a good deal in Syria and being not a big guy that is sensitive on human rights and having no great sympathies for Syria in the first case. One thing that he might give to Russia as well is to let them live in Syria as well, where he has little leverage, but there might not be that much pressure from the US either to get the Russians out. So Syria is complicated and very interesting to watch because it's not clear yet how this will end, but it's not obviously the Russians out, as people thought in the beginning after the fall of the regime. I think that we can safely say. In Libya, not much has changed. Yeah, that remains a divided country and a kind of stalemate in which the Russians are heavily involved on the opposition side, on the Haftar front. They have their energy interests down there, and I don't think much has changed for them there in a my understanding, rather stagnant situation down there. If we come to Cyprus and Greece, what is interesting, and we have to include Turkey here, the relationship between Russia, Cyprus, and Greece has massively changed in the last years, and the Russian-Ukrainian war has altered a lot of things. Greece and Russia historically are rather pro-Russian, and have, in particular in the case of Cyprus, find a policy using the Russians against developments they didn't like, in which they suspected the Americans and the Brits to be involved, or even Turkey, in order to balance their influence in the UN Security Council by other means. So it's a very pro-Russian country, giving Russia a lot of influence and a prominent role in the famous Cyprus dispute. But since the late Anastasiadis period, and continued under Christodoulidis, who's considered a pro-Russian man, Cyprus has oriented itself clearly to the West, and so has Greece, in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war. So what they've been doing has been very offensive to Russia. Russian influence in Cyprus has dramatically decreased. That's what everybody agrees, including Russian diplomats I talked to. It used to be the strongest, arguably the strongest foreign player on the island, and now they're one of the players trying to see what is left of their influence. And the Greeks are being worried how big the punishment of the Russians could fall out if they get really, really upset, because it's a small, weak player that has chosen a side, and the side is not the Russian side, while trying to limit the damage. So in our famous Cyprus problem question, if we should have a deal, the question, I would still believe that the structural interest of Russia in the Cyprus problem is not to solve. So if Russia can play a role like it did in 2004, preventing a solution by securing a UN security resolution that undermined the security arrangements of the Afghan, it will probably play that role by maximizing its influence, its waning influence in the context of ongoing conflicts. It's one of these continuities that Russia likes in stable situations and destabilizations. It's also true to Ukraine, or Georgia will maximize its influence and have influence over proxies. So it's a complicated answer. Greece is a bit more complicated because, again, it's traditionally pro-Russian, has been at the forefront of criticism of Russia in the Ukrainian war, but that might not last. The situation there is very, very volatile. And Turkey is a super interesting case because this is a frenemy relationship. Yeah, they support Ukraine and deal with the Russians and play both sides. On a leadership level, Trump, Erdogan, and Putin are very much alike. In particular, Erdogan and Putin are very much alike in their approach to politics. They're very pragmatic in the way they will strike deals with each other, and they're far more predictable than Trump is. So Erdogan is not that predictable either. I mean, that's a long answer to that question, but I hope it gives you an idea, yeah, on which we then would continue if you had more time.
Thank you, Hubert. Konstantinos, would you like to answer the second question?
I agree with Hubert first of all on the first one, and I think the derussification process of Cyprus, let's say, moving towards the west, makes the Russian presence in Syria even more important for Russia, right? And I think the incentive not to solve the Cyprus problem now has become even greater compared to the past when it comes to Russia. Now, whether Turkey's privileged position as a mediator in the Middle East, I don't think it's a privileged position as a mediator, but Turkey is a country that is extremely important for the region. I cannot emphasize this enough. And even though it has problems with pretty much everyone, at the same time, nobody can ignore Turkey's influence in many ways, from soft power to training military people, to sending troops, to send weapons, to have the ability to talk to everyone except Cyprus, maybe. So it does have a huge role to play. Not so much in the Middle East, however. I think its role will be elsewhere, in Ukraine potentially, but in the Middle East, I don't think it can change the current state of international relations. I will go back to what Hubert said about the Gulf states being very careful not to completely destroy their relations with Israel. So they consider what's happening now in Gaza as a temporary setback. And that's where Turkey actually might have a bigger problem rather than playing a mediator. It actually might have to find a way to come back into the picture. So it would be very interesting to see how Turkey will react to the developments in Gaza and to the developments of Hamas as an organization, and who's going to run Gaza. So I don't think Turkey's role in the area is so much as a mediator, but rather as a very strong regional player. So I would phrase it as that.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. Again, Hubert, would you like to add something?
And inspire the others to ask further questions. Yeah, I agree with Konstantinos, and I would
actually, sorry to interrupt you. We don't have time for more questions because our meeting was planned for 1 hour. So you are giving us now a kind of a closing remark.
Oh, then I should be brief, so that you survive this in a reasonable amount of time and can do the pleasant things of life. No, I just wanted to add that, as I said, it's a very problematic player, Turkey. in the region. And I think there are very few who would trust it as a mediator, and very often it's more part of the problem than part of the solutions. The Israelis don't want to see anything of Turkey. This is also the country that is the successor of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire might have provided a very good period of relative peace for the region, but Turkish nationalism in the late Ottoman Empire is still remembered in the Middle East. So you're not too keen on a strong role of Turkey. Where I see the problem is energy. If we come back where we started, if the East Med is constituted by potential energy confrontation, but also cooperation, but unfortunately also by confrontation, this is why we might see the next moves. It is very clear that there's a push for Cypriot gas to be used to supply Egypt to prevent a destabilization of the country. So while the Cyprus problem might be dormant and there's very little prospect for substantial progress in my assessment, the issue that will pop up is, will Turkey allow, and also the Turkish Cypriots as their proxies or their allies in this matter. So will Turkey allow the exploitation of gas for the supply of Egypt, or does this require a solution? And you can resolve this constructively and have energy cable arrangements and win-win situations, which is what we hope for. But this can also go very, very confrontational. And then we have a very different role of Turkey in the region. And because the world has become such a lawless place under the Trump administration, both options have, or let's say the confrontational has at least a little bit more likelihood than I would think before. So reasonably thinking there should be a win-win arrangement easily possible. And I still hope that the interest in stabilizing Egypt prevail over any attempts to destabilize the situation in order to get their way in the gas question, where they have maybe legitimate concerns. Maybe end there. So I see more trouble than cooperation, and with Trump removing reliable frameworks and guarantees for arrangements, it's so hard to predict in which direction we go. Let's hope it goes well. But in this region, things going well, if you listen to what we both said, is not the likely scenario.
Thank you very much, Hubert. Thank you, Constantine. Actually, the fact that you have both underlined the uncertainty and the volatility of the region points to the fact that it's very useful to study the region. So our master's program is, you are all more than welcome in our master's program to delve into these issues. Thank you very much for participating in the event. Thank you very much, all of you who have attended the event. You are all eligible to receive certificates of attendance by the distance learning unit of the University of Nicosia. Let us keep in touch, because we are more than willing and enthusiastic to organize more events like this in the near future. Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
And thank you, Michali, for organizing and coordinating me.
Thank you, Michali, and I'm very happy to share my PowerPoint, because I see the question in the chat function. So I'll send it to Michali, and if there's a way to send it to you,
it can work either way. You can both send to me your PowerPoint presentations for those who would like to receive them, or you can be contacted directly. Either way works for me perfectly.
Always fine with me.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely night and good weekend.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.